So Pieter, thank you. Good evening. A book currently causing a stir in certain circles is called The Stellenbosch Mafia-Inside the Billionaires Club. It's about some of the richest people in our society. They have several things in common. They're all men, they're all white, and they all have a close association with the town of Stellenbosch in the Western Cape. The book examines how these men became rich and, I suppose, what they do to stay rich. The author of the book is the journalist and author Pieter du Toit, and he's with me now. Pieter, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, Stephen. It's good to be here.
Firstly, the first obvious question is, why Stellenbosch? It's surely about more than just the rugby. Is it also the wine? How did this group of people end up around Stellenbosch?
Good question, Stephen. Obviously, the book was motivated by the fact that the term or the phrase the Stellenbosch Mafia has become so politically loaded the last couple of years. It came to prominence around the time that Bell Pottinger drove their disinformation campaign. It's become quite an infamous phrase, and people have started asking questions about this so-called mafia. Who are they? What do they do? And like you rightly say, how did they gain their wealth? And someone like Johan Rupert, whose name and surname has become synonymous in political circles with white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation, all the rest of it, became the de facto figurehead of this grouping. And it seemed like an interesting subject, which, like you rightly say, centered around this sleepy wine Stellenbosch student town called Stellenbosch.
You mentioned probably the biggest name of them all, Johan Rupert. He probably won't thank me for saying this. He didn't make his money, and he inherited most of it and made more of it. You managed to spend some time with some of these people. There's this idea that the rich are different to us, and yet we all love the stories that show exactly how similar they are to us. Is he the same but different?
Look, what struck me about Johan Rupert, and I spent some time with him at his house, the old adage that old money doesn't shimmer, and I think I found that to be true with Rupert especially. He doesn't need to flaunt his wealth, and he doesn't do it either. But they do live a different life. If you've got a private jet and you can fly anywhere at any time that you want, if you can call on the people that he can, investors in New York, the Secretary of the Treasury in Washington, D.C., the head of the IMF, the chief executive of Alibaba in Beijing, then you've got quite an influential network. So they do live different lives, and they're just as fallible as normal human beings are. And, what struck me as well, spending time with many of them, is how touchy and prickly they are to public criticism.
In other words, they actually feel Twitter? They actually feel the barbs?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And I think especially someone like Rupert, who's turning 70 this year, is starting to worry about his legacy. And that was the motivation behind that disastrous Power FM interview that he did in December last year. He's worried about how he is perceived, especially amongst black South Africans, especially amongst the black middle class. And it was a spectacular bomb, that interview.
There are all sorts of interesting class differences, even among the wealthy. So some people inherit their money, that's sort of old money, even if it's not really very old. Some people make their money, so it's new money, even if it's not very new. Are there that sort of class distinctions among this group?
Spectacularly so, Stephen. I discovered, and I always knew this, I went to school and studied there as well, so it was a difficult book to write, because you know many of these people, and you have to give an honest, or attempt to give an honest appraisal of this town, because there's a lot of criticism in society about the wealth disparities, and there's a difference in Stellenbosch between people that were born there, originals from Stellenbosch, and so-called inkommers, which is an Afrikaans word for people that came in from the outside. There's a very strict distinction. Someone like Marcus Jooste from Steinhoff, for example, he studied there, but he was never considered part of the firmament. And he brought Steinhoff back to Stellenbosch because he wanted to be like Johan Rupert. He wanted Steinhoff to be a Remgro, and obviously that did not work out quite as well.
Obviously, there's a lot to talk about with apartheid. So a lot of these people, certainly, let's put it like this, by 1994, most of them were already, if not very rich, on the track to being very rich. Would they have done as well, or nearly as well, if it hadn't been for apartheid? It's a sort of crucial question about our economy and how it works.
Absolutely. No, I don't think there's no question that many of them would not have. But there is a distinction between people that made their money after 94 and those that made their money before 1994. If you look at the so-called new money, Capitec, PSG, those are companies, Mediclinic, that came of age after 1994. PSG was established after 94, as was Capitec. So those are two examples of businesses that did particularly well in the democratic dispensation. Before 1994, and I tried to trace that story in the book, the rise of a company like Rembrandt that became Remgro, Anton Rupert's big vehicle, he was a project Afrikaner nationalism. He was a project that was born out of the rise of Afrikaner nationalism. So there's no doubt that a company like Remgro, before that Rembrandt, did particularly well given the environment where they operated in, where Afrikaner businesses were advantaged. And in a society where white businesses was given preference. Black businesses almost did not exist.
And I suppose even after 1994, they were in the best possible position. They were far better off than almost everyone else in this country to do well as the economy opened up and there were investment opportunities in other countries.
Indeed, many of them were exceptionally well placed, and Rembrandt is one of those. So Johan Rupert, you mentioned that he did inherit his money. Yes, he did. But what he did was totally revamp and redesign a company called Rembrandt that was focused on cigarettes and had major interests in the liquor trade. So those interests are minuscule these days. It's an investment vehicle, investment company, and has become very, very successful.
The figure of Marcus Jooste, he sort of looms large. He is the person who, and I think the evidence shows this, that he cooked the books for Steinhoff. He's made one sort of public appearance in Parliament because he was subpoenaed. He's resisted all the other urges. He's sort of stuck just down the road in Hermanus, I think, most of the time at the moment. This is sort of the first big, open, public, international scandal from this group of men.
Yes, it is. And it was interesting to see the animosity between the old money and the new, where Remgro, the Remgro group of companies, or the individuals and companies and some of those very rich billionaires in the Remgro orbit, how they detested someone like Marcus Jooste, who came in from the outside, even though he studied at Stellenbosch, even though he attended or lived in the same university residence as many of these super rich did. He was never quite accepted into the inner circle. It was quite interesting speaking to some of the leading lights in town, some of the leading billionaires, saying, when Marcus Jooste and Steinhoff arrived, suddenly they saw lots of Ferraris in town. Suddenly they saw wives of middle executives being driven around in chauffeurs, them all of a sudden starting to flaunt their wealth and sponsor the rugby club, for example, which irritated a lot of them.
Okay, so do you think he's been further ostracized? Has he been kicked off all the WhatsApp groups now?
Look, I think it's the town's still recovering from Steinhoff. I don't know anyone in Stellenbosch, anyone that I spoke to, bar the Remgro grouping, who did not have money in Steinhoff, who did not invest in Steinhoff. And they talk about Steinies, their shareholding in the company, the shares that they held, and all of them lost money. There's an anecdote that there was almost 40 houses worth 5-10 million rands or more that went on sale immediately the days after Steinhoff crashed. So it hurt a lot of people. It hurt confidence in the public, in the private sector, because, like you well know, there's a lot of criticism that we only focus on corruption in the private sector or the public sector, whereas Steinhoff is as bad as anything we've seen in the public sector.
Obviously, the headlines the weekend your book came out were around Floyd Shivambu, an interesting character, the deputy leader of the EFF, to be involved with the Stellenbosch Mafia, and particularly Johan Rupert. He's denied having any kind of sort of, political relationship or otherwise with Johan Rupert. But have you got proof that there was some kind of communication between them?
Well, you've got three people on the record, including Johan Rupert, including the CEO of Remgro, as well as GT Ferrari, who's the former chairperson of First Rand, who confirmed on the record that they did have these lunches with Floyd Shivambu. In fact, Floyd Shivambu is not only a once-off visitor to Stellenbosch, that he's been there more than once, and he didn't exactly deny meeting them. He just said, he doesn't think he's got a relationship with Rupert. So I think that there's enough on-the-record evidence from people who aren't exactly known for fibbing in public. And what Floyd Shivambu did do, he did acknowledge that he did go, they did meet with Remgro executives to talk about a project that he wanted to tackle.
Okay. These groups of people, you talk about how many people were involved in Steinhoff. Their interests seem to obviously align, but they also intersect. If if I wanted to borrow money from you, it would help if you're a billionaire. It would help if I'm a billionaire. The chances are we would invest in the same things over time. Unfortunately, this is unlikely to happen. But presumably in Stellenbosch, they help each other to become richer.
That's the finding. Not the finding, but people are disappointed when I try to explain that it's not an organized grouping, a mafia as such. It's not a formal grouping of people who try and subvert, societal norms or structures or conventions or whatever the case may be. It's a very powerful and very influential network of people that, are of the same generation, that went to the same university schools, university residences, and made their money in Johannesburg, incidentally. And then they use these networks to further their own interests. If you look at networks in Johannesburg, if you look at networks that centre around the University of Cape Town, University of Witwatersrand, they are as strong or stronger. I think there's a political dimension to the Stellenbosch Mafia. There's a race dimension as well. And it's all part, it grew out of the Bell Pottinger narrative of 2016, 2017. But the fact is that they are a very strong and influential network, and they use their linkages to advance their own business interests.
Right, we all know how interested Johan Rupert was in politics, particularly in 2017. I mean, the whole country was. I suppose still is. But do they have a significant political impact now? And I mean, this would really go to the heart of what kind of relationships do they have, and I suppose, with ANC people?
Look, Stephen, I think the current struggle between the public protector and President Cyril Ramaphosa might impact on this group. The public protector, in a report that was released last week, speaks about donations to the CR17 campaign. She speaks about 3 donations from a single donor of 30 million, 40 and 50 million, I think it was. So there's a real drive from certain quarters to try and expose, who donated to the CR17 campaign. And I think it might impact on some of these gentlemen because they do try and influence politics, because they do have an interest in where the country is headed. So I've no doubt, that there's still more to come in as far as politics and the so-called mafia is concerned.
Do you think they have, the president, other people in the ANC on speed dial?
They do. There's no doubt that they do. I think politicians and businessmen the world over, it's not something new. We saw that with the previous government of Jacob Zuma, where there was a business family from Saxonwold who had a president on speed dial. It's how the politicians react to the overtures from businessmen, and obviously our businessmen manage these relations as well. They want to ensure that their investments in the country is safe. If they can influence the political environment, they will do so. But I think that's true for most sections of society where they try to influence politics of the day.
You write a book about white, rich men. You do it in red. Is that a joke?
The marketing people said it stands out on the shelves in the shops.
Pieter du Toit, author of the book, The Stellenbosch Mafia-Inside the Billionaires Club. Thank you very much indeed for coming through. It's a peaceful.